Hi, my name is Cindy Meinert. Welcome to this breakout session for the 2020 Camp Elam Women's Retreat. We are really excited to have you with us this weekend. I know we're all disappointed about not being able to be up at camp, but we're so glad you've joined us this weekend. I've been teaching cooking lessons for about 15 years, maybe 20 years. I haven't kept count exactly. And I've done a little bit of catering. And this afternoon, I'm going to teach you a really fun recipe called gnocchi with a Pomodoro sauce. Gnocchi is a kind of pasta. If you haven't had it before, it's a little ball of pasta. It's often made with potato. And Pomodoro sauce is just a sauce that's a tomato-based sauce. It literally means golden apple. And so it's just going to be a tomato sauce. And today our sauce is going to be seasoned with fresh herbs. And this sauce, the herbs really are what primarily give our sauce its flavor, and it's important to use fresh herbs in this sauce today. And I want to start out just by talking about our ingredients today. And most of these ingredients are going to be really familiar to you, but I think that ingredients, of course, are the most important thing in our cooking. And since this is a sauce that we're taking the time to make from scratch, I want us to just talk for a minute about those ingredients. So since we are using fresh herbs today, these are all herbs that we can find in our local grocery stores. I happened to find my oregano on sale. And so those oregano stems are going to have a few dark leaves on them. And so as I prep my oregano, I'm just going to pluck those dark leaves off, and I'll just throw those leaves away. Sometimes finding these herbs on sale is a great way to save some money, and that's fine to just pull those dark leaves off. That's going to be no problem. Often in King Soopers, at least, the basil across the aisle from where these smaller herbs are hanging, I can find it in a larger container like this. The small container of basil is about $2. This larger container of basil, which holds about 4 times as much, only costs twice as much. And so I usually buy this bigger container, and then I just try to make a bunch of recipes that call for fresh basil. That's a way for me to save a little bit of money, and then I get to use a bunch of fresh basil. So I like to do that. And then here's just a word about the way I store my fresh herbs. Most of my fresh herbs I do keep in the refrigerator, and I think they store the best that way. Parsley is an exception. I think parsley stores the best, just the way I would store fresh flowers. So when I get home from the grocery store, I cut the ends off of it, and then I just put it in a glass with some water, and it stays fresh for a really long time. More than a week on my windowsill. It doesn't get any fresh light, but in a room that gets some fresh light, I don't know if it would stay fresh longer or a shorter period of time. And if that water gets fouled, if it starts to get cloudy or gross, I just pour the water out, put some fresh water in there, and then I just pull out the stems that I need. And it looks pretty in my kitchen too. So that's just a word about the herbs. Now this recipe also calls for some olive oil. And let's see, I just bought some olive oil. There's a whole variety of olive oils, of course, that we can buy at our grocery stores. And there's often questions about which olive oil should I buy. Well, olive oil, when you get it up to a certain temperature, loses a lot of the nuance of its flavors. And so people sometimes keep several different kinds of olive oils in their pantry. I don't do that just because I don't have a very big pantry. I don't have room to do that. And so I buy first cold pressed olive oil because I want olive oil that has the most amount of flavor so that when I am making a salad dressing or something like that, I have the olive oil that's going to imbue the most amount of flavor into my salad dressings. But if you do have the room to store more than one kind of olive oil, it's worth it to have an olive oil that's of a lower quality so that you can save the money. Because when you heat olive oil up, it's going to lose a lot of the nuance that first cold press olive oil has. So take the time and look at your grocery store and see what kinds of olive oils there are. It might be worth spending the money to have a couple different kinds. Now, our King Soopers does have a kind of olive oil, this California Olive Ranch. And I have found that this is a fantastic olive oil that has a really fruit-forward flavor. My husband and I love this olive oil for when we are making salad dressings, and I do keep this extra olive oil for when I am making a salad dressing from scratch or drizzling a little olive oil on a salad or something like that, like if I'm making a bruschetta or serving a really nice cheese. Other than that, I just keep 1 jar of olive oil in my fridge or in my pantry. Let's see. We're also going to be using mozzarella balls in this recipe. Now, you can get all different sizes of mozzarella at King Soopers, and I don't know which other grocery stores you go to. This recipe, when we end up putting it in the oven, what we're going to want is a mozzarella ball that's about the same size as the gnocchi. So when you read through this recipe, it's going to say cherry tomato size mozzarella balls. When you go looking at the grocery store, you're going to see that there's a lot of different sizes. So you could get this cherry tomato size, which is what I've ended up buying, and I'm going to cut these in half. Now, I could have gone ahead and bought the smaller size, and then I wouldn't have had to go to the work of cutting them in half. So play around with it and see what kind you end up liking. You could also have gotten the large log of mozzarella, and then you could have just chopped it up into sizes. Sometimes those big logs are on sale, and then you could save quite a bit of money and just give yourself a little bit more work. So just customize this recipe and see what works best for you. The last ingredient that I want to talk about are tomatoes. And this recipe calls for San Marzano tomatoes. Now, with some of the shortages that we're having, today I ended up having to buy organic tomatoes. Those were the only San Marzano tomatoes on the shelf. San Marzano tomatoes are grown in a particular region of Italy that has a high volcanic lava soil. And it ends up with a tomato that has a really sweet, low acidity. And these make a fantastic tomato sauce. They're a plum tomato, and you certainly don't have to buy this kind of tomato. But when I'm making this recipe and other tomato sauces, I do try to buy San Marzano tomatoes. I think it's worth it. There certainly are other plum tomatoes on the grocery store shelf. I read an Epicurious article a few years ago that had a taste test of different brands, and this Cento brand was one of the top brands of San Marzano tomatoes, not the organic necessarily, and this of course is about $1 more. So when I can find the non-organic, that's the kind that I choose to buy. Let's see, the Muir Glen was the other brand that was another top quality in the taste test. But if you have the time or the inclination, do your own taste test. You can of course buy any tomato, any canned tomato for this recipe, but I would give it a try with the San Marzano tomato and see if you can taste the difference. So I just want to quickly go through this recipe. It's something I like to do before I try a new recipe, just so I can kind of know where I'm going. So the first thing we're going to do is put our olive oil into a pan. I'm going to do this in one pan, the pan that I can use both on the stove and then put into the oven. We're going to put quite a bit of oil. It's going to be the base for our sauce. And we're going to put our herbs into the pan at a pretty high heat. And what we're going to do is kind of deep fry these herbs. And we're going to leach out of those herbs all of the flavor and leave it in that oil. And then we're going to take those herbs out of the oil and just toss them. And then we're going to lower that heat. We're going to put in some chopped onion and garlic. And on a low heat, we're going to cook that onion and garlic until the onion is translucent. And then with our bare hands, we're going to crush the tomatoes, and we're going to put those tomatoes into the oil that now has the flavor of all those herbs and the translucent onion and garlic. We're going to turn that heat even lower down, and we're going to just slowly, for about 30 or 40 minutes, simmer that tomato sauce and let all those flavors meld together. We're going to have added a little salt and pepper and some red pepper flake. That's to your taste. My husband and I like our tomato sauce a little spicy, so I'm going to put probably about half a teaspoon of red pepper flake, maybe not quite that much, but you do it the way your family would most enjoy it. After 30 or 40 minutes, we're going to put a splash of heavy whipping cream in there to thicken up that sauce and give it a nice rich flavor. And then we're going to add oh, hello, that's my cat. You're going to hear every once in a while. And then we're going to add the gnocchi, which we're going to cook while the sauce is cooking. Those gnocchi don't take long at all, just like a regular pasta. And we're going to put the gnocchi and the mozzarella balls. We're going to pop that dish in the oven. Let the mozzarella melt, as well as some shredded Parmesan that we're going to sprinkle on the top. Bake it for just a little while. Let that all melt and meld together. And then that dish is ready to go. So let's get going on this dish. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you guys an onion cutting technique that I think is just nifty. Now this is something that I've learned from watching chefs on TV and then also from a lot of practice. Oops, sorry about that. I had a little camera catastrophe there. After many years of practice, I've discovered this is the fastest way, the most efficient way to cut an onion. An onion has two ends. It has this end that has these fine hairs on it, and then it has this end that has kind of a long string on it. First, we're going to just sort of take off this skin of the onion. Get as much of that papery skin off as you can. And then we're going to slice off just the end with this long string. Okay? And then we're going to cut down the middle of this end with the hairs on it. Right down the middle there. And what we're left with is two halves of this onion, okay? So now we're just going to peel off the skin and any layer of this onion that we need to peel off before we can cut it. But we're leaving this end with the hairs here intact, okay? And what we're going to do is with our knife, we're going to slice all the way around this onion, just like this, but we're going to leave this end with the hairs intact. So I hope you can see this here on my cutting board. And we're just going to carefully slice around, making little wedges, but leaving those hairs intact. So what we're left with is kind of a fan-shaped piece of onion here. So then, when we put it back on the cutting board and we cut it this way, we're going to quickly get that onion chopped up and end up with just the perfect chops of an onion. And this recipe calls for a half of an onion. But my onions that I happened to get from the grocery store were very small. So I'm going to go ahead and chop up my whole onion. So you play that by ear. My onions are extremely small right now. I'm not sure what that was about. So again, I'm just going to peel that extra layer off. I'm going to cut down, making little wedges, leaving that hairy end intact. And then I'm just, let's see, I'm going to get my angle a little different here. And I'm just cutting. So all we're left with is this little nubbin with the hairs. And we've quickly got our perfect pieces of onion. That to me is the quickest way to end up with great little pieces of onion. So even though the onion and garlic don't come along for a little while in this recipe, I'm going to go ahead and get them prepped so that as soon as the herbs are done, we can go ahead and get them going. So of course this is a head of garlic. This recipe calls for 3 cloves of garlic. Now the opposite is true of my garlic. My onion was very small. My cloves of garlic are huge. So the recipe calls for 3 cloves, but I'm only going to use 2 because my cloves of garlic are giant. I mean, they're twice as big as usual. Now, if you have a handy garlic press, this would be a perfect recipe to use your garlic press for. If you don't have a garlic press, there's a great way to get garlic. The easiest way to get your garlic peeled is to give it a little press with your hand and just kind of crack that skin. And it helps it come off much more easily than if you just try to peel it without cracking it first. like to just get that rough end off of it. And then another little shortcut for getting garlic going is to just give it a good crush with your knife. Now, if you're not really confident with your knife, with crushing it with your knife, which is what I do, you can also just use a good pan. You can get a little saucepan that you have and just give it a good whack. There you go. And once you do that, when that garlic clove gets good and mashed on your cutting board, that just gives you a nice head start on getting that garlic chopped. This recipe doesn't give really clear instructions on what we need to do with this garlic, but I don't think most of us like to take a big chunk of garlic in our mouths when we're eating any kind of pasta sauce, so I like to chop this garlic up pretty finely when I'm making a pasta sauce. And we all know garlic likes to get stuck on our knives when we're cutting it up, so we got to keep scraping it off there. That's looking pretty good. Okay, now I'm going to do this one with my knife just to demonstrate this in case you haven't seen that. So I point my knife blade away from me and I just place my knife blade on that garlic, and with the heel of my hand I just give it a good whack. A piece of it ran away from me there across the stove. That happens sometimes. And I just give it a good little smash. And because I'm sort of pushing my hand away from me while I do it, there's no risk of me cutting my hand on that knife. But the bottom of your pan works really well too. And when I'm teaching cooking classes to children, of course, I always have them do it with the bottom of a pan. I don't really teach kids to do that with a knife. That doesn't seem like that would be a very good idea. Okay, so we've got our garlic and our onion prepared. I'm just going to give my hands a quick wash. Okay, so we're ready to get our oil going. So I'm just going to measure out a 1/4 cup of oil. And I'm just using that extra virgin olive oil. And we want to bring this up on a pretty high heat. And like I said, you can do this in any kind of pan you want. I like to do it in one pan, the same pan that I'm later going to put in the oven. So this is a 2-pan dish. It's going to need one pan to make the sauce and another pan to make the gnocchi. And then later, after we cook the gnocchi and drain it, it'll all get mixed up in this pan. So this recipe calls for 4 stems of parsley. So I'm just going to pull them out, and it's the whole stem that we're using. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 stems of oregano. And I'm just looking for those ugly brown leaves that I talked about earlier. 1. And I'm going to pick the fattest stems in here, the biggest stems. 2. There's a good big one. 3. That one's really big. 4. 2 stems of rosemary. 1, 2. Whoops, I lost count on my rosemary. 1, 2. Okay. And 2 stems of basil. one. Well, that one's too big, I think. I think I'm not going to use that whole thing. And that one's too small. Okay, so there's kind of two. I'm sort of guessing on these. All right. Okay, so now we're just going to put all that whole thing in there. And because of the liquid, now this is a real woody end on this basil stem, so I'm going to take that real woody part off. Because of the liquid in these herbs, they're going to pop and sizzle a lot. And that's okay. But you kind of want to stand back a little bit so you don't burn yourself. I'm going to use some tongs. And that's sizzling a little too much, so I'm going to turn my heat down just a little bit. And you just want to make sure that all those herbs get down in that oil. And just stir them around. And this is going to take 3 to 5 minutes. We want these herbs to get dark brown or dark green and a little bit crisp. You can sort of flatten them out, help them get in that oil a little bit. And it already smells delicious. It smells like these wonderful Italian herbs. This is one of our favorite recipes to make for company. And this is a great 2-stage recipe. You could make the sauce the day ahead of time and then just make the gnocchi, bring that sauce back up to temperature slowly on the stove or even in the microwave, and then just put it all in the oven the day company's coming. Great time saver. You could even make this recipe in a double or triple batch if you wanted to and freeze it. Just gonna let that sit there for a minute. Let that hang out. It is hard to resist stirring it, though. And if some of it starts to get burned looking or anything like that, just pick it out, throw it away. That just means it's gotten all the liquid out of it. And the sizzling sound is actually the water coming out of the herbs. That's what that sizzling means. Okay, I think my herbs are just about ready. Give them a little peek there, see how it looks. Yep, they're starting to turn dark green. All right, I'm going to pull this one out. That one's dark green for sure. Just going to let that drip for a minute. Oh, I'm sorry about that. try to keep as much oil as I can in the pan. And just fish these out one by one. All right, I'm going to turn this heat way down. Now there are a couple primary differences between Asian cooking and Western European cooking. And one of those is the way we cook onions and garlic. In Asian cooking, garlic and onions are cooked at a much higher temperature, bringing out their acidity and their bitterness. In Western European cooking, onions and garlic tend to be cooked at a much lower temperature, bringing out their natural sweetness. And that's true in this recipe. So we want to make sure that our heat is not too high. Otherwise, our onion and our garlic are going to cook way too high, and they're going to get brown, and they're going to bring out too much bitterness, and this sauce is not going to be sweet the way we want. So I just put in a couple pieces of onion there to see what the temperature of my oil is. And as you can see, those onions are really sizzling. So if we put our garlic in there right away at the same temperature that those herbs were frying in, that garlic is going to get brown really fast, and it's going to burn, and it's going to give this dish way too much bitterness. And it's not going to have that smooth, sweet taste that we want to have in our Italian food. So I'm going to just let that oil cool down for a minute, and it's going to happen pretty fast. And if you need to, just take your pan off the stove and just let that oil cool down. There's nothing wrong with pulling your pan off the stove for a minute. And if it'll help to swirl it around if you want, just let that oil cool off. All right, let's try it again. Okay, I'm going to give this a good stir. That's better. So it's sizzling, but it's not sizzling and popping too much. So we want to do what's called sweating our onions instead of sautéing our onions. And we just want to draw out the moisture in our onions and our garlic. And it's okay if they sauté a little bit, but we want them to turn translucent rather than brown. We're not trying to caramelize them. We're not trying to get a nice crispy edge on them. We're just trying to cook the moisture out of them, cook them through, and get them to have that nice translucent look to them. And I'm going to give them just a tiny little sprinkle of salt. That sometimes helps onions cook a little bit, especially at our higher altitude. So just giving them a little tiny sprinkle of salt there. That'll help them cook too. So it's kind of up to you what temperature you do this at. It really depends on how much heat your stove kicks out and what kind of pan you're using. So my stove has now stopped making any sizzling noise. So I went from high to low, and now I'm turning it back to medium. So just kind of keep an eye on that. You don't mind a little bit of sizzling, but you don't want these to be sizzling too much. Just keep an eye on them. If your onions start to get brown and you have an electric stove or your pan isn't cooling off fast enough, again, just pull your pan right off the stove. Don't worry about that. If you can control your heat quickly enough by turning it down, that works great too. So this is going to take a couple minutes. to go ahead and open these tomatoes. And we're going to use all the juice in these tomatoes. Now the recipe says to crush them by hand. You certainly don't have to do that. But the point of that is to get kind of a rough crush on these. And they are going to squirt and make quite a bit of a mess. So I'm going to pour them into a bigger bowl. Just so they don't make too big of a mess when I do that. I'm just going to keep stirring these every so often. I'm going to do a little multitasking here. So in this beautiful can were these whole tomatoes in this sauce. So I'm just going to put well, I've been doing all these different things, so I'm going to give my hands a quick wash before I do those tomatoes. Okay, so I'm just going to put my hands right in this bowl, and I'm just going to give those tomatoes a nice little gentle squeeze. Now I'm going to lift one up so you can kind of see what I'm doing. I'm just squeezing them, and you don't have to get every single little bit squeezed out. You're just kind of working them out. If you give them a quick squeeze, you're certainly going to get some tomato juice squirting around in your kitchen. So the lower you can keep them down in that bowl, and kind of the slower you can work them through your hands, the less mess you're going to make. I should warn you, if you do have some cuts or anything like that on your hands, this is gonna burn a little bit, because tomatoes, of course, have some acid. So you might want to wear some gloves. A lot of us have gloves around these days. Or you could even use a fork. You could use the instrument that we use to work Crisco into our pasta, or into our pie crust, whatever that thing is called. I can't think of it right now. And that doesn't take but a minute. So I've got all my tomatoes worked through. I wouldn't use a stick blender. That probably would do too good of a job. And then I'm just going to use a spatula and get as much of it off my hands as I can. I don't want to just wash that away. And then I'll just rinse my hands off under the tap again. Okay, my onions are making some good progress over here. If you're not sure how soft your onions should get, you can always just have a little taste of them and see if they're starting to get soft. Just about the time they're starting to get soft is about the same time they start to get translucent. So I'm just going to take a little taste and see what's starting to happen in here. Don't forget they'll be hot, so blow on them. Well, mine are still pretty crunchy, so I'm going to wait a couple more minutes. But they're already starting to taste good because that oil tastes like those herbs. It's just delicious. Okay, I think that's just about right. So, I've crushed my tomatoes. I'm going to just pour those right in that pan. I'm going to scrape all that goodness out of here. I don't want to waste any of it. Look at that. That looks beautiful with those onions and that tomato. Just so simple, those flavors. But knowing that it has those herbs in there, yum, enticing. Oh, there's a little stray flake of basil or something in there, yum. So I'm going to add a little bit more salt, just a little pinch. And this, of course, is to taste. And a little bit of black pepper, also to your taste. And remember, you can't get pepper and salt out of a recipe, but you can always add more. So easy does it. I've made this many times, so I kind of know how my husband and I like it. And then especially with the red pepper flake, because that's going to intensify as this recipe cooks. So I recommend you start with just a little bit, maybe a 1/4 teaspoon, and then see how it goes. Maybe taste it in about 20 minutes and see what you think. That red pepper flake is going to get stronger and stronger as it cooks. And I'm just using plain old red chili flake. I'm going to put in a 1/2 teaspoon because we like this a little spicy. And I'm just going to sprinkle that in there. Stir it in. Okay. So I'm going to bring this up to a simmer. Now here's my explanation of boiling versus simmering. Here's a boil. This is the bubbles on a boil. This is a rapid boil. And this is a simmer. So we're going to bring this up to a simmer. And then I'm going to put a lid on it. And so we're going to need to turn it down even more, because with the lid on it, it's going to keep it at a simmer at a lower temperature. So let's get this going to a simmer. And I'm just going to give this a little taste and see if it has enough salt and pepper in it for me. I think it needs a little bit more salt. Now it is going to have a little bit of salt from the Parmesan, but not too much. And of course the gnocchi is going to require quite a bit of salt, so stir that up a little bit. All right, let's see how this is doing now. Okay, so I've got my bubbles starting. All right, that looks like a simmer to me. So I'm going to put my lid on, turn that down, and I'm going to let that go for 30 to 40 minutes. We'll be back. Once you have this seasoned just the way you like it, with enough salt and pepper and the appropriate amount of red pepper flake, and you get this to a simmer, you're just going to leave it on a low simmer, uncovered, for 30 to 40 minutes so it can get nicely thickened. You're going to want to stir it about every 10 minutes just to make sure it's not sticking. If you come into your kitchen or you come back and look at it and it's boiling and it's just going at too high a rate, just turn your heat down, give it a nice stir, and bring it back down to a lower temperature. We're just trying to get it to thicken up. And we're just going to let that sit for 30 to 40 minutes. And while it is simmering, we're going to cook our gnocchi. So we're just going to prep our mozzarella balls. These are those little balls that we talked about at the beginning of the class. And all we're going to do is drain these and cut them in half. Most of these balls are going to come in a container with a lot of liquid, and you're not going to need to keep that liquid. So I just keep that lid or get a little strainer and just drain that out in your sink. Sometimes they come vacuum packed, and then they don't need quite as much draining. And we want these to be about the same size as the gnocchi or a little bit smaller. And all I'm going to do is cut these guys in half. Real simple. If you want to buy a smaller size and save yourself the trouble of cutting them in half, it's perfectly fine too. The last ingredient that we're going to talk about is our Parmesan cheese. Now, of course, you can buy Parmesan cheese already shredded, and you can buy Parmesan cheese in a can. But for this recipe, I would highly recommend that you buy a block of Parmesan cheese. Most of the grocery stores carry it these days, and it doesn't really matter which brand you buy, but it is worth it, I think, to buy something that's not shredded yet. It's just going to have a better flavor, and the grocery store will generally cut you whatever size you need, and so it's not going to be prohibitive in terms of the cost. This block that I bought, I went ahead and bought the whole, about a little less than half a pound, because this will last a really, really long time. Parmesan is a very hard cheese, and it's not going to mold very quickly in your fridge, and so it'll last a really long time. And even this hard rind that we don't generally use to grate up and eat, you can put that in a sauce or a soup, and it will itself imbue a lot of flavor. And then you just take it out after you've finished using it in the cooking. That's a little pro tip there that I learned from watching chefs on TV. So even that last little bit of the rind is useful for the eating. So I do buy this, but you could just cut it off and just get what you need. So we just need a half a cup, and you can grate it as finely or as in as big chunks as you want for this. We're just going to use a half a cup of grated cheese just at the very end of this recipe to put on the top. So I'm just going to grate some of that to put on the very top of this recipe. And I've got a little grater here, so that's all I'm doing is just grating this cheese. So our sauce has been simmering away here for about 40 minutes. It's gotten nice and thick. A lot of that liquid has reduced, and when I stir it, it leaves a trail on the bottom of the pan. That's kind of what we're looking for. It's giving us a nice thick sauce. And so now the last step of our sauce is that we're going to add that 1/4 cup of cream. And this recipe calls for heavy whipping cream, which I think gives the nicest, richest flavor. Of course, you could choose to use a less fatty cream. It just won't have quite as rich a taste. So we just pour that right in there and stir that in. That, of course, is going to loosen the sauce up a little bit more. Just stir that up to get the cream nicely incorporated. And I've got my water right now coming up to a boil because we're getting ready to cook our gnocchi. But still, at any point you could take this sauce off and save it and finish this recipe another day. You could finish the sauce with or without the cream and freeze it with or without the cream. I probably would freeze it without the cream. Sometimes freezing milk products gets a little weird, but you could certainly freeze this sauce. Whoops, I made a mess. You could certainly freeze this sauce without the cream in it, and it would freeze beautifully. Okay, so we're just going to let that sit and wait until our gnocchi is cooked. Okay, so my water is coming to a boil now. So I'm going to turn my oven on. We're going to finish this recipe by broiling it. So I've gone ahead and got my oven preheating to a broil. My water is at a nice full boil. So I'm just going to pop those gnocchi in there. Now, gnocchi is like any pasta. You want to cook it at a full boil. And it's only going to take 3 to 5 minutes. So I'm going to carefully dump those in there. I don't want to burn myself. Hold on. Just drop those gnocchi in there. Now, gnocchi, you can tell when they're done, they're just going to rise to the top. Now I sometimes have to put my lid back on to get my water to come back up to a boil. So I'm just going to pop that lid on for a minute and I sort of just listen to my pot. My stove is not a very hot stove. I don't have a very high gas output from my stove, and so my stove doesn't cook at a very high heat. So I really have to keep a lid on often to keep my pasta boiling. I don't know what your stove is like, but unfortunately I don't have very much gas coming to my house. Let's see what's happening. You know your gnocchi are done when they start floating to the top. And so you want to just peek in there, and as your gnocchi float up there, they're getting finished. So wait until they are all or almost all at the top. Now, and you don't want to stir too much because that will sort of force them to rise. So you want to just kind of leave them alone. Maybe give your pan an occasional little shake in case they're stuck. I would stir them right at the very beginning, but then as they get closer to getting finished, just leave it alone. Otherwise, you're going to kind of force the process. So it's kind of fun watching them bob up there to the top. And I kind of peek in, push them to the side, see how many are left there at the bottom. All right. And then tasting is key, of course, so I'm going to take one out and taste it and just make sure that... Now, my water never returned to a boil here. It's just now coming, but I think that's because we're here in Colorado. So I'm going to taste this one guy and make sure it's pillowy soft. Sure enough, it's the perfect texture. Pillowy soft, it's exactly the way we want. So I'm going to drain these gnocchi. I'm going to drain these just like I would pasta. Just nicely drain them, but we're not going to rinse them. We're just going to drain them and get as much liquid off them as we can. Then we're going to put them straight into our sauce here. Okay, now we're just going to stir them gently in here. We want them to be coated with this sauce, but we want to do this gently so that we don't break them up. And you could use a rubber spatula if you prefer. Doesn't have to be perfect, of course. And you could add some meat to this dish if you wanted to. It would be delicious. But this is already a very rich dish. I don't think it really needs meat. Sometimes I serve this with grilled chicken. A lean meat I think is really good with this because it's such a rich dish. I think this dish is also really good with fish. I've served this with a really nice thick grilled fish. But I also just serve this as a vegetarian dish. It's so filling and so rich. I don't think it needs meat. I like to just serve this with a nice vegetable, and since my oven's already hot, I often roast a whole lot of zucchini, like big zucchini pieces, chunks. Okay, so we've got our gnocchi distributed in there, nicely coated. We're gonna just plop these mozzarella balls in there. And now you can see how they're about the same size as those gnocchi. And of course you could put more or less of this mozzarella if you wanted to. I believe the recipe calls for 8 ounces. And that seems like just about the right amount to me. Everybody's going to get a couple bites of that mozzarella. And then last but not least, our half cup of parm. We're just going to sprinkle that over the top. Okay, now we're going to pop that into the broiler for about 5 minutes just to give that a beautiful color and get all that cheese melted. So I'm going to pop that into the broiler and we'll see what it looks like. Okay, I've brought that out of the broiler. Now my broiler ended up being a little hot. I kept a really close eye on it and I only left mine in my oven for about 4 minutes. Let's take a look at it. Wow, I love the way that looks. It's got a beautiful orange, beautiful color to it. The cheese is melting beautifully. This would look even beautiful with a little extra chopped up basil on top of it. So I think I'm going to do that. And then last but not least, something my grandma always did. Just a little tiny drizzle of fresh extra virgin olive oil. There you go. Gnocchi with Pomodoro sauce, start to finish. I hope you guys really enjoy this recipe. I hope it's something that you'll make again and again. And I hope it's something that you'll really make your own. Add different things to it, take away things from it, and just make it what you want. If you end up having any questions about it, please feel free to find me on Facebook or get my contact information from camp. I'd love to talk to you about cooking, and I would love to cook with you. So find me and let's cook together. You guys have a great weekend, and I hope you've enjoyed this retreat. I hope God blesses you richly and that this is a time that He meets you where you are. I've just been really encouraged thinking about the way the Holy Spirit is with each of us in our homes during this time, and that even though we can't meet in our churches, the church is in us and Christ is with each one of us. So God bless you. Take care.